Opening the center allows for rapid piece development and early territorial claims. Instantly establishing central presence, this knight jump readies for battle across the board, hinting at a dynamic Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian setup. Securing central space and preparing to challenge Black's knight. Unlocking the Queen's bishop while preparing to contest the center is a solid, if somewhat passive, choice. This knight's sortie to f3 reinforces the pawn at d4, preparing kingside castling and central pawn expansion while maintaining flexibility. Preparing the fianchetto, Black invites a queenside pawn race, potentially opening the queenside for piece activity while weakening the queenside pawn structure. Preparing fianchetto, this move aims for kingside solidity and eventual queen's bishop development, anticipating Black's potentially active queenside play. Developing the bishop to aim along the long diagonal perfectly counters White's kingside fianchetto, contesting control of central squares. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, preparing for kingside castling and solidifying control of the central dark squares. Challenging the central pawn structure head-on, Black immediately introduces a dynamic pawn struggle that promises rich tactical possibilities and sharp positional play. Suddenly, the center explodes, injecting immediate tension and demanding a clear commitment from both sides regarding pawn structure and piece activity. Opening the center with this capture, Black boldly challenges White's pawn chain and aims to disrupt the harmonious setup, creating immediate tactical possibilities and influencing central pawn dynamics. Aggressively pushing the knight to the edge of the board creates an immediate target, potentially sacrificing tempo for a short-lived initiative while leaving the kingside slightly less defended. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now with g6 is a prudent choice, preparing to develop the king's bishop and potentially create a safe haven for the monarch behind a fortified pawn chain, a crucial consideration given the central pawn exchanges. Developing the knight to its natural square reinforces the center and prepares for potential kingside castling, while also eyeing the d5 pawn and offering a tactical out if Black's pawns become too advanced on that flank. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, this move prepares for a more assertive presence on the queenside, potentially challenging White's central control and offering improved piece coordination. Securing the king behind a castled wall offers immediate safety, a crucial foundation for future operations as White prepares to utilize the central files, potentially opening them with pawn advances, while Black's bishop on b7 now has a clear diagonal to exploit. Solidifying the king's safety now that the center has been broken open is a wise priority, preparing for the inevitable pawn storms and potential tactical skirmishes ahead. Targeting the d6 square now, the bishop prepares to exert pressure along the newly opened diagonal while also defending the kingside's central pawn structure, a common strategy in this particular variation to disrupt Black's harmonious development. Solidifying the pawn center, Black prepares to activate the queen bishop and reclaim central space, a sensible counter to White's ambitious pawn push. Disrupting the pawn chain, White liberates the c-file for potential rook activity and initiates a strategic exchange that opens lines, forcing Black to reassess their central control and potentially expose their king's safety down the newly cleared pathways. An immediate knight sortie to the edge of the board aims to disrupt White's central control and eye weaknesses, but it risks losing tempo and becoming a target. Reorienting the bishop towards the center, White seeks to activate this piece, potentially aiming for squares like e4 or f4, from which it can exert pressure along the diagonal or support pawn advances. The previous pawn capture on d5, while opening the d-file, also created a potential weakness on that file for White, making piece development and coordination crucial. This bishop repositioning also subtly influences the central pawn structure, indirectly contesting the e4 square should Black ever consider challenging the d6 pawn. It prepares for a more fluid cavalry deployment, ensuring pieces work in concert rather than in isolation. Black's knight now ventures towards the queenside, a subtle redirection aiming to bolster the pawn structure on c5 and potentially eye the c4 square, hinting at a future skirmish for central control or a preparatory maneuver for a queenside expansion. Unleashing the f-pawn signals white's intent to seize initiative on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially expose the black monarch. This aggressive pawn push creates immediate tension, forcing black to consider defensive preparations rather than continuing their planned piece maneuvering. White is gambling on gaining space and creating attacking chances, accepting a slight weakening of their own kingside structure in the process. The question now is whether black has the necessary defensive resources to weather this onslaught, or if white's ambitious gambit will prove overwhelming. Preparing to challenge white's central pawn thrust, 13. A6 initiates a nuanced queenside expansion, aiming to create counterplay on the flank and prevent white from consolidating their spatial advantage. White now redirects the bishop's gaze, aiming to bolster the queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare for an advance on that flank, shifting the game's focus from the center. Reining in the knight's adventurous sortie, the black piece retreats to a more solid defensive post, preparing to bolster the central pawn structure and potentially contest the d5 square. Asserting dominion over the queenside, this pawn push aims to restrict black's knight and potentially open the file for future incursions, forcing a strategic reevaluation of black's queenside expansion plans. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, black creates immediate play on that flank, aiming to disrupt white's spatial advantage. Opening up the bishop on the longest diagonal is a key idea now, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially disrupt their coordination. The aggressive advance of pawns on the kingside has created some weaknesses, and bringing the bishop into play here helps to exploit that. It also prepares for a potential queenside expansion, though that will likely take more time. This maneuver also facilitates knight transfers, perhaps rerouting the knight to a more active square on the queenside or supporting an advance of the b-pawn. The move addresses the pawn tension in the center and prepares to contest the open c-file if it arises. It's a patient repositioning, seeking to improve white's piece activity and prepare for a more dynamic phase of the game. Asserting control over the center's weakened squares, the queen swings into action, eyeing the long diagonal and providing support for the knight's eventual advance. Aggressively pursuing kingside expansion, white initiates a pawn storm aimed at dismantling black's defensive structure and creating attacking avenues. A bold challenge is issued, aiming to dismantle the pawn chain and inject chaos into white's central structure. This knight's relocation to a central outpost promises active participation, potentially stifling white's queenside expansion and creating fascinating tactical possibilities. Pushing the g-pawn advances white's kingside pawn storm, aiming to pry open the h-file for the rook and create attacking chances against black's castled monarch, though it simultaneously weakens the light squares around white's own king. A strategic concession, this knight's retreat to d7 implicitly signals resignation of the queenside initiative, surrendering crucial central space to white's advancing pawn phalanx and opening a tantalizing diagonal for the white bishop. Black seems to be opting for a defensive posture, perhaps hoping to consolidate behind this withdrawn knight and weather the coming storm. The king's safety remains paramount, and this move doesn't immediately jeopardize it, yet the long-term consequences of ceding this ground are a significant positional burden. Will this seemingly passive choice eventually prove to be a masterstroke of patience or a critical misjudgment? The answer lies in black's ability to generate counterplay and justify this quiet redeployment amidst white's growing spatial dominance. Unleashing a bold pawn sacrifice, white immediately aims to pry open the kingside and exploit black's slightly passive development, creating immediate tactical complications. Black immediately shores up the kingside, reinforcing the idea that the immediate tension on the kingside with white's pawn push needs careful attention, while also preparing for potential counterplay down the e-file should white overextend. The bishop's repositioning to the fianchettoed square intensifies pressure along the long diagonal, aiming to exploit black's potentially awkward pawn structure in the center while keeping an eye on the kingside. Unleashing the bishop, black targets the compromised kingside flank and aims to disrupt white's advancing pawn wall by forcing exchanges and opening lines. Sharpening the attack on the queenside, this advance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create clear targets. A fascinating detour into the queen's flank, seeking to dismantle white's kingside expansion before it can fully mature. Unleashing the knight to b3 is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create a potential weakness on the queenside. It's a provocative move that immediately injects dynamism into the position. While it might appear to abandon the kingside, the idea is to force white to commit resources to defending their queenside pawns, thus slowing down their aggressive intentions. The knight, previously tucked away and somewhat passive, now becomes a powerful disruptive force, eyeing the c1 square and potentially influencing the pawn's advance. This maneuver forces a strategic recalculation for white, who must now consider the pressure on their own king's safety versus defending their queenside. It's a calculated risk, gambling that the disruption will be worth the potential positional concessions. Unleashing a tactical storm, white sacrifices material to pry open the kingside and exploit the exposed black monarch. Opening a crucial kingside file, this concession creates immediate attacking avenues for white's rook and queen, particularly targeting the weakened g6 square. Securing the queenside with the rook provides a crucial defensive posture, simultaneously preparing for potential queenside expansion while safeguarding against black's active knight and bishop. Exchange on c3 dismantles white's pawn chain, weakening the kingside structure and creating a doubled pawn on the c-file. This opens lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and bishop, to penetrate white's territory. While it simplifies the position, it trades off black's active knight for a passive white bishop, a slight positional concession to gain tactical initiative. Opening the b-file for the rook creates a significant imbalance, potentially leading to sharp play. Instead of recapturing on c3, considering moves that strengthen white's pawn chain, like h3 or even a simple move like re1, might offer a more solid approach. The current pawn structure with the doubled pawns on the c-file presents a long-term weakness that black will likely try to exploit, while the opened b-file offers white counterplay. The knight on c5 is a powerful outpost for black, and white needs to be mindful of its influence, especially its potential to jump to b3 or d3. Ultimately, the decision to open the b-file is a calculated risk, aiming for active piece play and a potential attack, but it undeniably introduces immediate complications and structural concessions. The queen's foray, hitting the king's flank, creates immediate chaos, forcing a crucial decision about king's safety and the exposed bishop. A crucial defensive maneuver, this pawn advance shores up the beleaguered king and attempts to create a secure haven, simultaneously blocking the powerful diagonal aimed at the monarch by black's bishop. Instantly injecting dynamism, e5 boldly probes white's pawn shield, threatening to unravel the queenside and exploit the compromised kingside. Focusing on the long-term development of the light-squared bishop, this repositioning aims to eye the queenside while simultaneously solidifying the central pawn structure and creating potential attacking avenues along the semi-open c-file should black commit to a further pawn push. Shifting a knight to the center often signals an attempt to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and control vital squares. Securing the monarch from further entanglement within the immediate battlefield's chaos, white shifts focus to the king's personal safety. A decisive realignment of forces, black liberates the pinned knight and simultaneously challenges white's central pawn structure, seeking to unravel the tangled position by forcing exchanges. A tactical reshuffle erupts as the rook sacrifices itself to dismantle black's powerful knight outpost and relieve the pressure on white's kingside. Seizing the initiative after the pawn sacrifice, black ignites a decisive tactical sequence by capturing the knight, aiming to dismantle white's king's protective screen. The white rook's relocation to the first rank aims to disrupt black's queenside initiative by contesting the open b-file, potentially creating a backdoor threat against the king or supporting a pawn push. Unleashing a whirlwind of activity, black sacrifices a rook to disrupt white's king's safety and open critical lines for attack. This aggressive maneuver not only clears the way for the queen and knight, but also aims to exploit the now exposed kingside, seeking a swift, decisive advantage. Reasserting central control, and preparing a daring retreat. A bold sacrifice, unleashing immediate chaos and forcing White's king into a precarious position, prioritizing material imbalance for an attack. Reclaiming the exchange, White aims to rebalance material and simplify the position. The immediate recapture of the rook on f3 is a necessity, as leaving it undefended would be disastrous. This move reopens the f-file for White's own rook and simultaneously challenges Black's exposed rook. While the material count is now equalized, White's pawn structure on the kingside has been significantly weakened by the earlier aggressive pawn pushes. Black, meanwhile, has a well-placed knight on d3, creating a strong outpost and potentially threatening further incursions. The position is entering a critical phase where White must carefully consolidate and find defensive resources, while Black will seek to exploit the lingering weaknesses. The king's safety of both sides is now paramount. A bold queen sacrifice materializes, aiming to shatter the enemy king's defensive shell by drawing the remaining attacker away. Clearing the immediate path for the king, the monarch steps out of the shadow of the rook, embracing a newfound degree of mobility in this complex, material-scarce landscape. The rook's redeployment to the open file is a crucial step in its offensive maneuvering, aiming to exploit the exposed king. Bringing the monarch closer to the action, the white king steps out from the shadows, aiming to participate in the developing skirmishes rather than remaining a passive bystander in the center of the board. A bold exchange that simplifies the position, relinquishing White's powerful bishop pair and opening the e-file for Black's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against the exposed king. The queen's forceful repositioning on f3 immediately confronts the pinned knight and forces Black to address the immediate threat to their own king's safety, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. Sensing a desperate opportunity, Black aims to exploit the exposed white king by forcing an exchange of queens, hoping to leverage the remaining material advantage in a potential endgame. Reclaiming the open central file offers a crucial pathway for your rook, aiming to disrupt Black's already precarious pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed king. The rook sacrifice brings the queens to an open position, potentially leading to a queen exchange that could simplify Black's material disadvantage. King exposure becomes a primary concern as White consolidates material parity. The immediate exchange sequence dramatically alters the strategic landscape towards an endgame where Black's isolated pawn on c4 presents a long-term target. Yet White's somewhat awkward king position on the e-file demands careful attention. Unleashing the queen into the heart of White's disrupted position, this aggressive push forces the immediate king relocation and highlights the severe damage inflicted on White's pawn structure, particularly the isolation of the rook on the e-file. The king is now exposed, needing immediate sanctuary on the queenside before Black's pieces, particularly the queen, can exploit the open diagonals. The sudden appearance of that queen, lurking to snatch a pawn with check, disrupts White's nascent kingside activity and forces an immediate tactical calculation, potentially opening lines towards the monarch that were seemingly secured just a few moves ago. The king scurries for cover, seeking refuge on the queenside, a desperate attempt to escape the onslaught of Black's unstoppable queen. Re-establishing central pawn presence is the immediate goal, aiming to consolidate the precarious pawn structure after the exchanges and perhaps reroute the queen to a more active square. The white king, abandoning its central sanctuary, now seeks refuge on the flank, a precarious maneuver given the open files and attacking potential of Black's queen and rook. The king's escape route solidifies, eyeing an active role as the remaining pawns become increasingly important for the final stages of this complex endgame. Reactivating the queen's offensive potential, this maneuver repositions the monarch's primary defender to eye the queenside and potentially support a breakthrough. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, Black attempts to inject dynamism and disrupt White's king's safety by creating potential attacking avenues on the queenside. Initiating a crucial pawn exchange, QB6 now aims to simplify the position, a strategic shift toward an endgame where White's rook activity on the open b-file might prove decisive. Pushing the pawn forward opens a diagonal for the queen, potentially threatening the rook on b6 and creating more space for black's king to maneuver. The queen aggressively penetrates, seizing the chance to simplify the position by eliminating that troublesome pawn and initiating an endgame where white might find some hope. Chasing the white king into the corner with the queen's perpetual check threat offers a glimmer of hope amidst the material disadvantage, forcing white to remain vigilant and prevent any unexpected tactical turns.